thank you for downloading this week's episode. As ever, any likes and shares would be greatly appreciated. Today's episode is the first of two regarding an extremely divisive topic within the environment movement, if not the most divisive, which is around the use of nuclear power as a tool to help combat the climate crisis. And I'll be talking to two very educated and able experts on both sides of this division. For this episode, I had the pleasure of speaking with M.V Ramana, who is a Simons Chair in Disarmament, Global and Human Security and Professor at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Ramana is also a member of the International Panel on Fissile Material, the Canadian Pugwash Group, an organisation that provides scientific and scholarly insights into the prevention of armed conflict, including nuclear abolition and nuclear disarmament, the International Nuclear Risk Assessment Group, and the team that produces the annual World Nuclear Industry Status Report. Ramana is also the author of a brand new book, Nuclear is Not the Solution, The Folly of Atomic Power in the Age of Climate Change. I found Ramana to be a very open person with a warm personality and someone who seemed to fully understand the counter-arguments in regards to the benefits of nuclear power, but who genuinely believes them to be ill-founded or too dangerous to explore. I've tried my best to keep my own feelings out of the discussions in order to let both Ramana and Mark Nelson, who is the pro-nuclear advocate on the next show, put their points across, and I just hope that by listening to both sides of the debate, you, the listeners, have a more detailed and better understanding of what the arguments are, and perhaps one of them have swayed you to be in either one camp or another. If so, it'd be great to hear from you, so please leave a comment on your thoughts. Obviously, it's a stretch to say that either show will have a definitive answer to the debate around atomic energy, but my genuine hope is that they are a valuable addition to the discourse. Now on with the show. So Ramana, you've dedicated your working life to understanding, researching and working within all things nuclear. But when was it when you were first introduced to nuclear power? And the reason that I asked Ramana is, some of my earliest memories was being dragged to CND protests by my mum in the 80s. I actually remember a particular protest in Moston in North Manchester where they got me to lie on the floor and they drew chalk around my body a few times, and that sort of indicated the kids that were killed in sort of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I'm just interested, when you first heard about nuclear power or seen a nuclear bomb and what sort of impact that had on you.
Yeah, so my introduction to nuclear topics couldn't have been more different in a way.
Right.
I was too young when India first tested nuclear weapons in 1974, so I remember nothing of that. But
Sure.
my earliest memories of nuclear technology were probably from late high school, college, and so on, where we were constantly told that India had an atomic energy program originally set up by this very brilliant physicist called Homi Bhabha. And this was going to be the way that India was going to generate lots of electricity cheaply. And this was a great application of science and technology to development. And so that's the sort of idea I had growing up. There was some part of my brain which kind of remembers that I didn't think of nuclear weapons as a good thing. That somehow it's an evil application of science was the way I sort of remember about it. I also do remember reading a little bit about Chernobyl accident in the newspapers,
Yes.
and that sort of making me start questioning this idea. But really, I got into this much later after my PhD. That's when I started doing research into this and looking at nuclear weapons in South Asia, nuclear energy in India, and then finally, sort of globally, what's the role of nuclear power in trying to deal with climate change?
Sure. Now, for me, in the environment movement, which I've been a part of for over a decade now, it really is a polarizing topic, nuclear power. There doesn't seem to be much middle ground. People either seem to be anti-nuclear or pro-nuclear. Could you just give us, for the audience, could you give us an overview of some of the arguments for and against, just to set the scene for us, Romano?
Definitely. Yeah. So let me start with the standard arguments against, and a lot of the environmental movement, if you look at public opinion polls and so on, there is a lot of opposition or at least reluctance to adopting nuclear power because it is a source of radioactive waste and we don't have a proven solution for dealing with radioactive waste.
Hmm.
That's often the first thing that comes up in the minds of many environmental people. There are others who are aware of accidents such as the ones that happened in Chernobyl and Fukushima, and talk about how bad that was. And then there's one small subset which probably is also aware of the connection between nuclear energy and nuclear weapons and sees that as a bad thing. And for a very long period, especially in the after the 1980s, after Chernobyl and so on, the idea that nuclear energy would be considered an environmentally friendly source of power would probably get you laughed out of the room. And but then in recent decades, that conversation has changed, with
Hmm.
the nuclear industry strongly pushing the argument that nuclear energy is a solution to climate change. And
Yeah.
among environmentalists who support nuclear power, there are basically two kinds of arguments they would say. One is we need nuclear power because it's a what they call a base load source of electricity, and I can talk much more about what that means and why that concept does not really apply very well anymore. And that so that's one of the only sources of non-fossil fueled base load source of power.
Yeah.
And the second argument is, yes, we know all of these problems with nuclear energy, but really the climate change is much more of an emergency. It's a much greater threat. So we have to accept nuclear energy with all its flaws. Now, there's usually a third argument that is added to the second one, which is to say that all of these problems of nuclear power are things of the past. And somehow the new reactors that are going to be built will be miraculously sort of safe and will not have any of the problems that afflicted the old kind of nuclear power.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, in a way, that strain of argument basically says whatever has been the problem in the past, don't worry about it because it will not happen in the future. Therefore, we can completely discount it. So, that's the kind of argument for nuclear power that some environmentalists have been adopting.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for that. Now, you've written a book. Now, just before we get onto the book in detail, Romano, what made you write it? Was it the fact that you felt that you'd acquired enough knowledge to write a book, or was it more of a case that you felt there was an urgency right now to write it?
That's a good question. It's a bit of both. So I've been
Hmm.
doing research on nuclear energy for a long time. I had been studying the nuclear industry. So originally, I started off thinking about this book as an exploration of why it is that companies and governments are funding this technology that we know to be expensive, that we know to be dangerous, and why is it that they are still continuing to fund? And so it was really a exploration of the political economy of that,
Yeah.
of nuclear energy and the energy policy making process. And then subsequently, as I had discussions, and here I'm going to give a shout out to my editor at Verso, Nicole Ashoff, who persuaded me that I cannot avoid all the familiar arguments against nuclear power. Those things had to be restated because there's a generation of people who are coming in who think of nuclear energy as a solution. So even though all these arguments have been made 100 times over by many people, she said, we want to hear this from your voice as well. So that's how the book took form.
Okay, yeah. And your book's called, I mean, it doesn't pull any punches. It says, Nuclear is not the solution, the folly of atomic power in the age of climate change. So you really have sort of nailed your colours to the mast there with where you stand in the camp. And do you know what, Romana? I think for our audience, whether they agree with you or not, I think it's very important that they understand the sort of credentials that you have in order to talk about this topic. So I have a list in front of me here of all the groups that you're involved in, but just for pick out some of the major groups that you're associated with in order for my audience to realize just why you're sort of credited or educated enough to cover this topic?
Oh my gosh, that's an embarrassing question to ask.
But you know what, though, Roman? It's very important because this isn't really about an opinion. It is an opinion, but it's a very educated opinion by somebody who is an expert. So just say like the top 3 or 4
Yeah,
the top level groups that you're associated with.
yeah. So I'll start by saying that I'm primarily an academic researcher. And a lot of what I have written in the book is summarizing academic papers that I have written for peer-reviewed journals. And having studied this for over a decade at this point. Um, but I'm also involved with this group of very unusual individuals led by somebody called Michael Schneider, who is a German but has been living in France for a very long time. He and Julie Hasman and Anthony Frogat, they have been putting out this report called the World Nuclear Industry Status Report. They started doing that a very long time back, but has been continuously doing it for about a decade now at this point. And the report used to be quite small. I've been contributing it since 2015, if I remember correctly.
Hmm.
And the report in the last year's report, for example, was about 500 odd pages of very detailed assessments using different criteria of nuclear energy. The cost, the time it takes to construct, the performance, and a whole bunch of other factors. And so this is a group that I'm privileged to belong to, that I've learned a lot from. I've also been part of the International Panel on Fissile Materials that's
Yeah.
concerned about the use of nuclear materials for use in nuclear weapons and how to reduce that threat. I've been involved with the International Nuclear Risk Assessment Group,
Yep.
which is a international group of people largely based in Europe, Austria, Germany, and so on, of independent experts on nuclear energy and especially the safety risks associated with that. I'm also associated with Canadian Pugwash, with yeah, and a bunch of other things, but that's long enough a list.
Yeah, so the Canadian Pugwash group, which sounds quite funny, but it's a serious group. It provides scholarly insights into the prevention and resolution of armed conflict, including nuclear. So it's just got a funny name. We don't want the audience to think it was a
Yeah.
funny group. It's
Well,
quite a serious
Pugwash
group.
is the name of a town in Nova Scotia
Yeah,
where a meeting was held in the 1950s that brought together scientists from the Soviet Union, the Soviet bloc, and the Western bloc, trying to work out the tensions of the Cold War.
yeah, yeah, brilliant. Okay, so let's delve in a little bit. So we won't be able to cover everything in the book, which obviously I recommend for readers to pick up. But let's break down. So you're vehemently in the camp of the anti sort of nuclear power group. Now, if you could give us maybe 2 or 3 reasons, big reasons that you think are almost insurmountable, yeah, as to why you believe this is not a pathway forward, especially for climate change.
Yeah. So I'll start by saying, even though most people would describe me as anti-nuclear, I don't describe myself that way.
Okay.
I usually point out that I am anti-nuclear weapons. I have a moral and ethical position against nuclear weapons. I don't think anybody should have nuclear weapons.
Yeah,
I don't
I agree.
have a similar position. There's no ethical argument against nuclear energy. There's a
Hmm.
kind of derived ethical argument because of the connection with weapons, because of some of the environmental problems. But I really look at this as comparing the costs and the risks of nuclear energy versus the benefits. And in my opinion, the costs and the risks vastly outweigh the benefits. So if that's, I can use the similar kind of argumentation to decide, for example, that I am not going to buy a house in Vancouver. Vancouver is too expensive, so I've chosen to rent a house. This doesn't make me anti-home ownership. But I think so. So just to set that context.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah,
But I think the arguments are, yes, as I said, everybody would describe me as anti-nuclear, and I don't necessarily have a problem, but I just want to clarify where I'm
yeah,
coming from.
sure.
Um, there are sort of broadly 3 sets of arguments that I think we should be aware of. The first argument is the well-known one, that nuclear energy is not a desirable way to deal with climate change because of the risks of accidents, because of the production of radioactive waste, which is an inherent part of any nuclear reactor, and because and of also the various waste that are produced throughout the nuclear fuel chain, starting from uranium mining and the health impacts of that. And lastly, the connection with nuclear weapons. I can talk about each of these in greater detail, but let me at this point just say that's one set of arguments which say that nuclear energy is not a desirable way to deal with climate change.
Yeah.
The second set of arguments have to do with let's take the position that many people have been saying, which is climate change is an urgent emergency and we need to do something about it as soon as possible, right? Does nuclear energy fit that bill? And my argument is no, nuclear energy is not going to be a feasible way to deal with climate change for two primary reasons. The first is that nuclear reactors are very expensive to build, and there is no getting around that fact. And the reason is that a nuclear power plant is basically a very complicated way to boil water and produce steam using a hazardous process, nuclear fission. And the fission process always produces radioactive fission products, radioactive materials that are hazardous to human health. So the primary purpose of a nuclear reactor is to ensure that these hazardous materials never get out into the biosphere. And that requires a lot of heavy duty construction, safety systems, and so on and so forth. So there is no way to build a cheap nuclear reactor. A nuclear reactor is always going to be expensive.
Sure.
And for a long time, the argument used to be that a nuclear power plant might be expensive to build, but it's cheap to operate because it does not require a lot of uranium. It's a very dense source of energy. And so the argument used to be that, well, even if it was expensive to build, over the long run, you're going to be able to make money because the cost of running the reactor is low. That argument has come unstuck in the last decade or so, and we saw a bunch of nuclear plants in the US, in Western Europe, shut down primarily because they could not compete economically on the electricity marketplace. And this is primarily because other sources of energy, in particular renewables, have even lower operating costs. They are because they require no fuel. Once you put up a wind turbine or a solar panel, the additional cost of each unit of electricity generation is pretty low. Some amount of cost for maintenance, but apart from that, not really a lot. And so nuclear power plants have become too expensive to build in many parts of the world. There are countries where these are being built, where the costs are really absorbed by taxpayers and or ratepayers for reasons that we can get into. Okay? The second reason why nuclear energy is not a feasible solution is that a nuclear power plant takes a long time to build. So you're in the UK and you know the case of Hinkley Point, right? Hinkley Point resulted from commitments made by the Labour government under Blair, under Tony Blair, and then subsequently Gordon Brown. They all sort of said, oh, we need to have a renaissance in nuclear power in the mid to late 2000s. They put in a lot of money and they made plans to build a whole bunch of reactors. And of all of those plans, the only one that actually has moved forward so far is Hinkley Point. And you know the story of how expensive it has become and also how long it has taken, right? So if a country like the UK, which has had a lot of experience with nuclear energy for decades, is taking 20 odd years to get one of these projects done, that should give you a sense of how long it would take other countries which are in a similar situation as the UK to actually get nuclear infrastructure up and running. Right? You can see the same thing happening in Finland, in the United States, and so on. It's going to be even more time consuming in countries of the global south, many of which don't have any nuclear reactors. The nuclear fleet around the world is highly concentrated. It's most of it is in countries which already have nuclear weapons, probably about 2/3 of all the reactors. And if you include all the countries that have military alliances with nuclear weapon states, that will be about 80 to 90% of all the reactors, right? So it's a very
Yeah.
concentrated source of power. Many other countries, let's say Nigeria or Indonesia, these are the countries where electricity demands are growing very fast and they have no nuclear power plants. So it's probably going to take them even longer for them to be able to set up the nuclear infrastructure, set up the regulatory capacity to be able to build these nuclear power plants. So nuclear power is going to be a very slow way to reduce emissions, if at all. And one way to see that is to look at what is the share of global electricity that is produced by nuclear power plants. That share used to be as high as 17.5% in the mid 1990s. And that share has been reducing consistently since then. In the last year for which we have data, which is for 2023, it was around little over 9%. Right, so it's roughly half of what it was, and this is primarily because of the high costs and the fact that it takes such a long time to build nuclear reactors that the share has been reducing. If indeed nuclear energy is going to be a solution to climate change, we should be seeing that share expand at the cost of fossil fuels, and that's not been happening.
Yeah.
Um, that's the sort of reason why I don't think nuclear energy is a feasible way. In fact, I would say that, to the extent that countries are investing huge amounts of money, and remember that these reactors cost tens of billions of dollars,
Yeah.
that money could have gone to renewables and other associated technologies which can be built more cheaply and more quickly and will reduce emissions much faster. So that's the
Yeah.
feasibility argument. The last argument I'll just say, then I'll end. I know I've been sort of meandering for a long time,
Sure. Yeah.
is to think about the political economy of this. Who are the people who are investing in nuclear power plants, who are benefiting from it? And the case of the United States is particularly interesting because the United States, the electricity sector is privatized, and so all the electricity is supplied by private companies.
Yeah.
And if you look at all the utility companies that own nuclear power plants, all of them also have large fossil fuel interests. They all have natural gas plants or coal plants or both. And so you can understand that many of these utilities might talk about nuclear energy, but they really don't want to see rapid climate action. They don't want to see fossil fuels being eliminated from the energy
No.
system quickly because that's cutting into their share of profits.
Sure.
And likewise in Canada, some of the loudest sounds we hear about nuclear energy are from provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan, which are primarily fossil fuel based economies.
Tar
Um,
sands and stuff. Yeah.
so there's
Yeah.
a political economy reason
Yeah.
not to think about nuclear energy as a solution to climate change.
Yeah. Do you know what? Wow, there's a lot there. There really is a lot there. What I would say is potentially, in regards to the world going nuclear, it is quite clear, Amanda, you'll know this, that the world's polluters are really in the global north. So even if there was a way of decarbonising the global north via nuclear power stations, that would be a massive um, impact in regards to climate change. But I do take your point in regards to how long they take and the cost of them, even for rich Western countries. Now, you mentioned Hinkley in the UK, but that we do have an absolute shit show of a nuclear power station called Sellafield, which I'm sure you'll be aware of, which is one of the old school type of nuclear power plants. And this has been racked with so much controversy and so many billions just to maintain it because it's falling apart. Now, granted, it is one of the old types, but the problem is we're now stuck with this particular nuclear power station for thousands, potentially thousands of years because of the waste. In fact, I'm going to add a link to this show, a big long read about Sellafield for people in the UK to read. I think they'd be quite shocked as to how bad a nuclear power station can become if it's not built correctly. But in regards to the new ones, Ramana, now there's a lot of people on in the environmental movement that are adamant that the cellar fields of this world are the past, regardless of how badly they've been made and having to be maintained. But they're convinced, Romana, that the new ones are all, they're all good to go. You throw them up, They're firing off loads of power. They're cheap to run. The waste is inconsequential and can be stored safely. And when I say they're adamant, they are adamant. So what are they missing about? Is it just that they've sort of drank the Kool-Aid on some sort of new way of thinking? Is this really not backed up with what you've seen in all these super modern nuclear power stations?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is something which I've been working on, or sort of trying to rebut this argument for more than a decade at this point. Most of this kind of narrative is about what are called small modular reactors.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's the one.
and the yeah, and the argument is that because they are small, they can be manufactured in factories, or at least their components can be manufactured in factories and shipped to the site where the nuclear construction happens, where the reactor construction is going to happen, and just assembled on site. So that's the modular part of the small modular reactors. And modular is something we are all familiar with because that's how most things are manufactured in society today. If you think about buildings being built today, you don't bring bricks to the
Yeah,
structure and
yeah.
bring sort of
Oh,
wood
modular.
and have carpenters sort of make stuff. Everything comes from a factory and just kind of sealed together on the
Yeah,
spot.
yeah.
So it's the same idea. There are sort of, but for both of these, there are problems with this. So let's talk about the modular part, since that's what I was talking about. So the nuclear reactors that were built in the state of Georgia in the United States, the AP1000 reactors from Westinghouse, which is the company that is responsible for the design of the majority of the world's reactors, pressurized water reactors. Um, the AP1000 was built as a reactor design that would lower the cost of construction and the time it takes to build using precisely this modular construction. It was a large reactor,
Yeah.
but the idea was exactly the same, that you would have modules that will be made in factories and sent. Now, and based on this, Westinghouse, when it first started selling this reactor design, this was during the first decade of the century. In the United States, there was also, like in the UK, talk about a nuclear renaissance. And that was propelled largely by the Energy Policy Act of the George Bush administration. And during those times, Westinghouse and various nuclear industry lobbyists would testify to the Senate and Congress that this new reactor will cost like $2 billion, $3 billion, and a nuclear power plant with two of these would probably be an order of $5 to $6 billion. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, and on that basis, there were a huge number of orders. So in that time, there were, I think, over 30 reactors that were ordered by utility companies all over the
Hmm.
US, and only four of them actually went forward to construction. Two in the state of Georgia and two in the state of South Carolina. By the time those reactor projects started, the cost had already jumped up. So
Right.
from
Yeah.
about $5 to $6 billion, it had jumped to $14 billion in the case of Georgia.
Mm.
And then subsequently, the South Carolina project was abandoned because the costs kept going up and up, and the time period got delayed. And the reason for that, and now I go back to the question of modular construction, the idea that modular construction is going to save the day or is going to help make the construction more foolproof is spoiled by the fact that you can have problems at the factory, right?
Mm.
And this is exactly what happened in the United States. There were lots of fabrication errors at the site of the thing. And some cases they discovered it on at the factory site itself, in which case they had to remanufacture it. And in other cases, they would send it to the actual site, and then they'll find that something doesn't work. Right. This also
Yeah.
happened in the case of the AP1000s that were built in China, where a lot of things didn't act as the way it was supposed to do. So in reality, what happened was Westinghouse used to have this module on its this computer simulation on its website that showed, like, it'll have like a clock 1 2 3 4, and each time there'll be one little piece of the reactor that will come together, sort of like Lego blocks.
Yeah.
And then at the end of that animated video, and after 36 months, the reactor was supposed to have been done. So they were predicting that to be done in 3 years. The actual construction of the Georgia plant, it took about 3 times as long. Okay.
Right.
And the final cost was $35 billion. So that was about, 6 or 7 times the initial cost estimate, right? And so modular construction doesn't really solve the problem because it can, and there's also another problem, which is if you're going to build large numbers of small modular reactors and put them all over the place, what if you discover a problem later on? This is what happens all the time with airplanes, right? Boeing has been suffering these manufacturing problems that then you have to recall the entire fleet of those planes to fix them. How do you recall a radioactive nuclear reactor, right? That's going to be a problem that people don't talk about. So that's the modular part. I'll now talk a little bit about the small part. The small part is that by small, they don't necessarily mean physically small. It just means that you produce less power. The definition of a small modular reactor is that it has to generate under 300 megawatts of nuclear energy, of electricity. And there are some designs, for example, Rolls-Royce in the UK, that claims it has an SMR, but actually the design is to generate 470 megawatts. So in the IEA terminology, that we called a medium-sized reactor. But that aside, when you go to a small reactor, there's a fundamental problem. The problem is that the revenue that the owner of the plant is going to get from selling the electricity is also small, right? Unless you build many of these reactors. Right. But the cost of building the reactor does not scale in proportion to the power that it generates. So a 900 megawatt reactor will not take 3 times as much concrete, or will not need 3 times as many wells or workers as a 300 megawatt reactor, right? So the cost is of a 900 megawatt reactor per megawatt is going to be lower than for a 300 megawatt reactor on a per megawatt basis. So the economics of SMRs are actually worse than that of large reactors. And a final point which I want to make is that when we think about nuclear energy, even advocates for nuclear energy realize there are 4 basic challenges for them. The cost is one of them. Safety, in other words, the risk of accidents. Third, having to deal with radioactive waste. And fourth, the linkage with nuclear weapons, the proliferation angle. And in your ideal reactor, you want less waste, you want less of a risk of proliferation, you want a lower risk of accidents, and you want it to be cheaper, right? No design can actually meet all these criteria simultaneously for technical reasons. For example, if you want to reduce the amount of radioactive waste, then you have to operate the reactor in what engineers would call fast neutrons, meaning that the neutrons are not slowed down using a moderator. That way you can fission more of the radioactive materials, you produce less waste per unit of electricity generated. But then when you do that, then there are new safety challenges which come from operating in the safety space, and you require a much higher amount of fissile material initially to start off the reactor to operate. That makes it more proliferation risky. Right? So there's always a trade-off, and there is no way to actually make all of this. So the bottom line is, and finally, I'll also say that these are not just theoretical criticisms of mine. If you look at actual small modular reactor projects, they have all been coming out to be much more expensive, right? The one that went furthest in the United States was a new scale project to be built for the Utah UAMs, a group of municipal power suppliers in Utah and southwestern America. And that reactor was supposed to be generating 460 megawatts. 6 of those reactors were supposed to together generate 460 megawatts. And the cost of that turned out to be $9.3 billion. Now, the Georgia project that I mentioned was about $35 billion for 2,200 megawatts. And so on a per megawatt basis, the new scale project was around 250% of what the original cost of the Georgia project was. And this was before the construction started, and you would have seen the expected cost overruns in the new scale as well. So it would have probably been much more higher, right? So all of that is to say that small modular reactors are not going to solve the problems confronting nuclear power.
Okay, yeah, very, very interesting that, especially the economics of it. Now, again, there's so much really to talk about. We're probably not going to be able to cover everything, but one in the UK, for people that are pro-nuclear, they hold up potentially two examples in Europe to show the difference between nuclear power nation and a nation that's gone down the renewable route, and they are France and Germany. So I saw an article that I read the other day that was talking about how France has many nuclear power stations, whereas Germany took a decision to decommission theirs and go down the renewable. Now, listen, I'm not an expert in the data, but the data seem to suggest that of the two, France had been more of a success. Are you aware of those two examples in your work, and what is your position on it?
Germany has indeed phased out all of its nuclear power plants, and if you look at the data on emissions or on fossil fuel use, between 2000, when the German phase out law went into force, was first legislated, and today, Germany's emissions have come down consistently. There have been, and also its fossil fuel use. Uh, that's primarily because all of the power that was generated by nuclear power plants has more than been compensated by production by renewables, okay, and also by improvements in energy efficiency. So the direction is perfectly okay. There were two blips in that curve. There were two brief points when emissions went up, and this had to do, I think, the first one was immediately after the Fukushima accident. Now, what happened at that point was the phase out law had been accepted in Germany in the early 2000s. And when the Angela Merkel government came to power, the owners of nuclear power plants, who are, of course, unhappy with the idea of phasing out, they went to her and they basically said, we want to operate our nuclear reactors for longer so that we can gain more profits. And she initially agreed to doing that. But after Fukushima, she reversed her position, seeing that the risks are still very, very high.
Yeah.
And so there was a brief point where, and she ordered the shutdown of some number of reactors very quickly, in sort of away from the original plan. So there was this brief blip at that point when they had to use more coal, and then the second time was during the Russia's attack on Ukraine. And sort of trying to reduce Russian imports.
Yeah.
Both of those have been overcome at this point. There are still, Germany is not a perfect case because Germany historically has had a large coal mining sector,
Coal. Yeah.
and
Massive
trying to
coal. Yeah.
figure out, and especially in what used to be East Germany, and you have to try to figure out how to find jobs for all of this. We don't want just a transition, we want a just
Of
transition,
course we do.
and
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
always a complicated thing, right?
Yeah. It is. It is.
And Germany also has this position of trying to be the industrial powerhouse of the world, exporting all kinds of things. So there's a lot of, the political economy there is very complicated. So
Hmm.
I don't think that this is the ideal scenario, but you can still see that progress is possible.
Okay.
The French case is very different in that the French decision to go into nuclear power was made in the 1970s by a very small group of technocrats, many of them associated with the École Polytechniques and other sort of higher institutions. And it was not a particularly democratically decided thing. But for one reason or the other, France did make the switch to a large number of nuclear plants. And so their electricity has been relatively low emission producing because of that reason. The
Hmm.
challenge for France has been twofold. One is because it's so dependent on reactors, its electricity system can do poorly if these reactors have a problem. And we saw this recently. There was a lot of corrosion that had been detected, and a
Hmm.
number of French nuclear plants had to be shut down And this happened especially between 2019 and 2022. And if I remember right, in 2022, the average French plant was down for 151 days of the year or something like that. Right? So at that point, France had to import electricity from Germany and from other places. Right now,
Yeah.
that's not necessarily a problem because all of these states, all of these countries have interlinked electricity grids, which means that they ought to be taking advantage of where there is cheaper electricity.
Sure.
And so that's not necessarily a fundamental problem,
Yeah.
but it's also a problem that says that France is not entirely reliant on nuclear power. It also has to
Yeah.
depend on all these other sources of power, right? And the risk is, what if there is an accident, right? So we saw this in the case of Japan. Japan, when the Fukushima accident happened, used to get a little over 30% of its electricity from nuclear power plants. That fraction quickly went down close to zero and still is in the, about 10% or less. Um, and so what happens to the electricity system if there is a problem, if there's an accident in a French nuclear reactor? That's, I think, the question that we are. So it's not a very robust or a malleable system. It's a very brittle system. And last, I'll also say, we really don't know much about the costs of nuclear power in France. But all we do know, to the extent we have data about it, is that the costs have been increasing significantly
Sure.
as more and more nuclear reactors were constructed. And so if you're thinking about the next reactor in France, and that's the EPR, which is the same kind of design as being constructed in Hinkley Point, the Flamanville 3 project has been fantastically over budget and has taken much longer, still not operational. And so France is not immune to the problem. So the question is, how does the French energy system move forward? Is it going to build more reactors, in which case it's going to have to spend tens of billions of dollars for each reactor, which each takes about 15, 20 years. And so the French, they are in a position where they are unable, to the extent other places have been able to do, to take advantage of renewables, which have become far cheaper and easier. And I think the UK is actually a much better example of how the system can pivot towards renewables much more quickly. And
Yeah.
the French system is it's not very nimble.
Yeah. Again, fascinating. So it's not a case of just looking at two countries and seeing simple black and white connections. They've both got nuanced narratives, nuanced stories that we have to look into in depth. So I think that's really a really important point. Now you have mentioned Fukushima in Japan. People of a certain age, not even that old. What year was the tsunami?
2011, March 2011.
2011. So it wasn't even that long ago. Most people in the audience will remember that. Now it's funny that, because as an example of sort of a disaster, yeah, and you mentioned there that it was out of operation for a number of months, and the nuclear energy system dropped, which caused an inconvenience to say the least. It is also held up, and I remember seeing a talk by George Monbiot a good few years ago. He also holds it up as an example of how safe nuclear reactors are in the face of environmental disasters. So even though the power grid went down, there wasn't really a safety issue in regards to the waste, or was there? Because there is a narrative, there is a sort of a subgroup that
Yeah.
claim it poisoned all the fish in the oceans and don't eat, from Japanese seas and that. So that's a little bit murky. But from what you know in your research, is it actually a good example of a nuclear power plant standing up to climate change in regards to an adaptation, um, or is it a good example of actually the more that climate change and climate breakdown, I like to say, causes mass storms and tsunamis and hurricanes and mass weather conditions that can effectively destroy most buildings. Where do you stand in regards to the Fukushima incident?
Yeah, I think Fukushima was a wake up. Was a moment to wake up and understand the risks associated with nuclear power. It's true that some people, like Monbio, sort of have chosen to take different lessons from me, but I'll try to explain why I think the way I do.
Yeah.
The first thing is that the narrative before Fukushima used to be that the big accidents that have happened, in particular Chernobyl, happened uh, in the Soviet Union, which was opaque and which had bad administrative systems, and they didn't care about safety. It would never happen in a Western designed nuclear plant. And when it happened in Japan, it basically belied that argument that light water reactors, modern light water reactors, would never have meltdowns, right? And
There was
also it happened.
Roman, there
Yeah,
was a smaller incident in America, wasn't there, as well, a nuclear reactor that
1979, yes, in
yeah,
3 Mile Island. And there have been a lot of close calls
yeah,
where we came very close to accidents. I don't want to go into all of that detail, but let's
sure,
go
sure.
back to Fukushima. So first of all, Fukushima was not supposed to have happened, and it happened, right? So that should tell you, first of all, that you shouldn't be taking what the nuclear industry says
For
as a
granted.
given, right?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, many of the people uh, who try to use Fukushima as an example of why even a large-scale disaster is not a huge problem, not only by the nuclear industry's narrative regarding future reactors, but also in the nuclear industry's narrative that radiation is not all that harmful. Okay, so much of the argumentation actually revolves around a very arcane point about how what's the risk associated with low levels of exposure to radiation, right? And broadly speaking, people who are pro nuclear energy will say that at very low levels, there is no risk. We don't have to
Yeah.
worry about it. Okay.
Hmm.
And once you say there's a threshold below which nuclear radiation is not harmful, then you can basically come to the argument that most of these accidents did not result in a large number of deaths. It is not a huge problem, etc., etc. On the other hand, there's a lot of scientific evidence which shows that radiation is harmful down to the lowest levels. Or you can extrapolate from what we observe at higher levels of radiation to how it will behave as you go to lower and lower levels of radiation. And most people who are in the public health community believe in something called a linear no threshold model for how radiation interacts with human health.
Hmm.
But the most important element of that is the no threshold, which means that there is no level below which radiation is safe. So every extra exposure to radiation increases your risk of getting cancer, as well as a whole number of other cardiovascular and other diseases that have been less studied than cancer. Okay.
Yeah.
The problem is, this is always going to be disputed. It's sort of like, in a way, some of the disputes over climate change, right? Where the climate change deniers will try to argue, oh, you can't show that this particular hurricane is because of climate change. You can't show that this particular heat wave is because of hurricane. We've always
Hmm.
had heat waves. We
Hmm.
always had
Hmm.
hurricanes, right?
Yeah.
So this is exactly the argument that pro-nuclear energy people are also using in this case by saying, we always have cancers. Cancers are common. We are all exposed to all kinds of things. Therefore, you cannot prove that this is due to radiation, right?
Got
But
you.
the question is, where do you use the precautionary principle, or do you kind of say, until you prove me in a court of law that this is the cause, we are going to assume that radiation is harmless, right?
Yeah.
And I choose to say, we should be listening to the people who are the most vulnerable, who are being exposed to the radiation, and you have to sort of try to take their side as opposed to the side of industry, which is trying to say that radiation is not particularly harmful.
Yeah.
Why is that important? Because a lot of the argument about how many people will die from Fukushima revolves around a lot of people who are exposed to relatively low levels of radiation, right? As opposed to a few people who are exposed to very high levels of radiation, right? And if you go with the linear no threshold model, the number of deaths you will probably calculate was, probably of the order of about 1,000 people will probably die as a result of cancers resulting from Fukushima. And Fukushima was a very lucky case, right? Even though it seems like a really bad thing, two other things happened that made the impacts much lower. The first was during the phase when a lot of the radioactive materials were being released by the reactors, the wind was blowing towards the ocean, right? And so a lot of the radiation went into the ocean. Now, it was probably bad for the marine life. Nobody has really done very many studies over that. But the people of Japan were not directly exposed to a lot of the radiation, right?
Right.
And the
Interesting. Yeah.
second was there was a spent fuel pool, a pool with all the radioactive spent fuel that has been discharged by the reactors, which is kept there to cool it so as to avoid overheating and melting and burning. That pool also got damaged during the tsunami and the earthquake, and some of the water started draining out. Now, if that process had continued, and it was very difficult to repair it because the levels of radiation in those areas were very high, so people couldn't go and repair any of those things. But what happened was there was fortuitously another accident, another unexpected event, which led to some water leaking from a neighboring facility that went and refilled the pool of water, right? And so
Okay.
two things happened that kind of compensated for each other, right?
Right.
If that
Yeah.
had not happened, if the second event had not happened, then water would have drained down and the spent fuel would have caught fire, and that has a lot more radioactive materials inside it. And this was the nightmare scenario that had been laid out to the Japanese Prime Minister Naoto Kan, who
Right.
was told, well, if this actually the spent fuel pool were to start burning, then the amount of radiation and the wind is blowing towards Tokyo, you would
Mhm.
have to evacuate Tokyo. Think of how hard it'll be to evacuate such a large city. We
Yeah.
didn't have to go through that. So it was very lucky that the impacts of Fukushima were not as bad as they could have been, right? And we
Yeah.
can't always count on luck in the future.
Definitely not. Definitely not. So, in what direction did Japan go after Fukushima? Because I don't actually know what it's like today. Has it been decommissioned?
Yeah, so it's this is a multi-decadal process. They still have not managed to remove the fuel elements that were sitting inside the melted down fuel elements inside the reactors.
Got
They are
you.
doing a bunch of stuff. They're also having a major problem because the site has a lot of radioactive material and water keeps flowing through the site and collecting the radioactive materials, and that water we don't want to enter into the ocean or into the biosphere. And so TEPCO, the company that owns the plant, has been collecting this water and trying to purify it, but it's not able to purify it completely. In particular, it cannot remove something called tritium, which is very close to hydrogen, a radioactive form of hydrogen. And as a result, they have this huge stockpiles of tritiated water, or probably contaminated with other things as well. And that's something they have been forced to release into the Pacific Ocean because they don't have the means to store this huge amounts of water that is being collected there. And that's
Brilliant.
what's been the source of some of the discussions we've had, or some of the news coverage about, the fish getting contaminated and so on and so forth. I mean, those are all valid concerns. Ideally, we don't want to have that happen, but
Yeah.
really the reason why this is happening is because TEPCO doesn't want to spend all the money to keep storing this and trying to deal with it. And so it just passes on the risks to the people around the world who are going to eat the fish, as well as the fish themselves. I mean, we should only be thinking about people. We
Sure.
should also be thinking about other
Yeah.
life forms.
Yeah, and it's brilliant that you said that. So appreciate that, speaking on behalf of the marine life as well, which is often overlooked. So Romano, just because of the time that we've got left, now you did say that the main issue for yourself was nuclear weapons. Now, what I'm going to do, Romano, because I think that one's pretty self-evident, I'm probably going to swerve that one, and I'm slightly more interested because you've not. This is potentially not a concern of yours, but nuclear waste. Now, you've said that nuclear weapons, you're not anti-nuclear if there wasn't necessarily for the nuclear weapons and a number of other things, but nuclear waste is one that's often highlighted in the environment movement as to a major concern as why we shouldn't go down the nuclear pathway. Now, just before at the start of the show, you did mention Finland. Um, in one of your examples for something. Now, I watched an absolutely phenomenal documentary about 15 years ago, which was about storage in Finland in a place called Onkala, which I believe means deep cave or small cave. And this documentary was fascinating, not only in the fact that it showed the technical nous that's needed to build deep into basically a mountain to store nuclear waste, but it also discussed some of the more philosophical questions, such as, because of the length of time that nuclear waste takes to no longer be hazardous, decay, you're talking about thousands and thousands of years where you almost have to account for every scenario that you can possibly think of happening to the human race or to the world, and create a safe environment for people that for example, it might get covered in rubble for 8,000 years, and accidentally people in the future might come across this place. How do you signpost a place in 8,000 years for a future people to tell them, do not come into this cave? It was all sorts of really philosophical questions that I thought was unbelievable. So what's your take on the waste aspects of nuclear power?
Yeah, I think it's not just 8,000 years, but it is 800,000 years.
800,000 years, yeah.
Yeah,
But suppose the example was
that's the kind of time we should be thinking
in
about.
8,000 years, if it gets lost and people, it's still radioactive, and people find this cave, how can you speak to people?
Absolutely.
Or even 10,000 or 20,000 years in the future, how can you make it safe? Yeah.
The answer is you can't, right? You can kind of tell yourself a story that, I'm going to make up some signs of skulls and bones or some, weird looking thing,
Well, that's
and
it, yeah.
and hope that it is going to sort of give people the impression that this is not an area to enter in. But we know that skulls and bones, for example, are the things that children are often fascinated by, and they think there's some hidden treasure out there. So we really don't know, right? But I think the simple answer is, we should start by just being humble and say, we don't know how to deal with this. We have never dealt with a problem like this, that's of material that's going to stay hazardous for hundreds of thousands of years. And remember, these are materials which are not present in the earth, right? We don't have cesium-137 anywhere in the world before the beginning of the nuclear age. These are all artificially created radioactive materials, which we have never had any experience. The human race has never had to encounter in the past, right? And so the simplest thing that comes to my mind is, the American aphorist Will Rogers used to say, if you find yourself in a hole, you should stop digging. And that's exactly what we should be doing first. We should stop producing this waste first, and then we can try to think about how to deal with it. And then the reality is, there will never be a satisfactory solution. By satisfactory, I mean something that can be proven to be safe. You will always have to accept a certain amount of uncertainty. But for the nuclear industry today, the problem is not the technical problem. The problem is primarily a public relations one. What they would really love to be able to do is to say, look, we have a solution, we found this repository, we put it there, it's going to be safe forever, and you can just forget about it. Let's go on with the building of new nuclear plants, right? And drop all your opposition to nuclear power, at least those people who are concerned about it because of radioactive waste. That's really what they want to say. The problem is that apart from all the sort of philosophical and the technical uncertainties, we also know that in Germany, there was a waste site, that was a repository that was set up not for high-level radioactive waste from nuclear plants, but lower concentration of radioactive materials in Asa. And then in the United States, there is the waste isolation pilot plant in New Mexico, which is dealing with transuranic waste from the nuclear weapons program, right? And in the WIP case, the project had a major accident in 2014 when some barrels exploded. right? The barrels were not supposed to do that, right? It turned out somebody had replaced one kind of kitty litter with another kind that was organic, but had not realized that some of these gases that would be released by the radioactive materials would interact with the organic material to create further explosive gases, which one of them is exploded, right?
Wow.
If you can't foresee what can happen in 15 years, what are the odds that you can foresee all possible failure modes for the hundreds of thousands of years?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
that, I think, is the reality that we have to deal with. And unfortunately, I cannot give a good solution. There is no
Yeah.
good solution, period, right? And people have been thinking about this for 60 odd years and have not really come up with anything that's better than this. That's because the radioactivity of the materials that we are concerned about is an inherent property. You cannot get rid of it, right? It's
Yeah.
not like a chemical that you can try to do some kind of a chemical reaction that makes it less toxic. This one is going to be radioactive no matter what.
Yeah, no, I found it absolutely fascinating with the waste thing. And even if we have done, we've worked out how to generate less waste for the amount we put in. That, like you say, that waste is the most toxic waste that the earth can create. And as you say, we're talking hundreds of thousands of years it has to be stored. It's even things like, I was going to touch on it, but I actually forgot. But when we're talking about France, we live in precarious times where, there is potential for acts of, for example, like terrorism in the future. I, I remember reading about, again, going back to Sellafield in the UK. Sellafield has just recently been fined for security issues. And it's potentially the most, for its size, I think it's the most toxic place in Europe for its size. And it's falling apart, and there's these sorts of things. And so we've how can you predict what is going to happen, and how can you protect all these generators that are effectively like mini Chernobyls with the right sort of bombs going off in them, for people with really nefarious ideas and causes and whatnot. So, that really struck home to me that we're not talking about how we deal with it today. We're not talking about how we deal with it in 100 years. These things cost more every year, and they last hundreds of thousands of years. So with that in mind, with that small discussion we've had there, Ramana, would you say that the waste is also an important part of why you would potentially be anti-nuclear as well as the weapons?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think again, the waste is I mentioned that I'm against nuclear energy because I think the costs and the risks outweigh the benefits. The waste falls into the risks category, right? The risk of, the fact that this waste can contaminate the environment.
Sure.
And so it is definitely an argument for me. I'm not dismissing it. I'm just pointing
Sure.
out that
Yeah.
I don't like to use the word anti-nuclear because that suggests a kind of
Got you.
ethical opposition as opposed
Sure.
to a more
Empirical.
opposition based on a
Yeah.
calculation, right?
Yeah. No, I totally get that.
Yeah, and I also want to mention that I think I don't always use the word terrorist because that kind of conjures up the idea of people with funny accents and turbans on their head and all feeds into all kinds of Islamophobic tropes. But I mean
Sure.
today the example that we can be thinking about is what's happening in Ukraine and Russia. Right, Russia and Ukraine were fighting over the Zaporizhia nuclear plant, and that came pretty close to accidents. There were sort of fires that were set
Yeah.
off. There
Yeah.
were drone attacks, all kinds of things that were happening. Nothing that damaged the plant, but that is more a matter of luck again than anything else. And today we are seeing that same being replayed in the case of the Kursk nuclear plant in Russia, where Ukraine is said to be attacking it. We don't know whether Ukraine did it or it's Russia. It's, of course, truth is very, very murky in that situation. But I mean, the point is, it doesn't have to be small groups of people who are trying to do bad things.
Sure.
Big
Sure.
states can choose
Yeah.
to attack nuclear plants and cause a huge amount of damage.
Yeah, 100%. No, good point. So just let's wrap up then, Romano. What I would ask finally from you then is maybe sort of not so much a closing statement, but maybe an overall view as to why you feel that we need to sort of transition away from nuclear atomic power, and maybe a pathway that you think that we should be going down and why.
Yeah. So I think the lesson I got from doing all of this work on nuclear energy and thinking about why it's not a solution to climate change is part of it is listing all of the problems with nuclear energy, but the other part of it is actually trying to think about what does it say about our current system that seems to propose nuclear technology as a solution to climate change, right? What kind of system would actually produce that? And that system is to be, what we can think about is this is a system that seems to allow for some people being sacrificed on the because to grow, right? So this is where the uranium mining and the radioactive waste, all this are going to be primarily on disempowered groups of individuals, often indigenous populations around the world, that are going to be subject to this.
Yeah.
Also, most of these nuclear plants are going to be located in far off places. They're not going to be in London. They're not going to be in Paris, right? And these are remote locations where the people who are primarily going to be at risk of something happens are the people who live near that, right? And this is the same structure of decision making and of this disproportionate benefits and impacts. Also, we can see this in the case of the fossil fuel system or even in the case of renewables, right? So if we have to deal with climate change, we have to have a larger systemic and political discussion. You are never going to solve climate change using a purely technocratic means unless you question the larger system and try to change the political economy under which these decisions are being made. And I think nuclear energy stands as a very good example of how bad the system is. It sort of stands in for a lot of the really pernicious aspects of our current economic and political system and how it deals with energy and the environment.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ramana. And listen, thank you so much for spending some time with us tonight and going through all those reasons as to why maybe nuclear isn't the pathway for climate change. I really appreciate it. And like I say, I'm going to pair this with a show with someone that's going to be fighting in the opposite corner. But I think both voices need to be heard, and the one you've put forward is a really, really strong argument. Okay, guys, this is a part of the show. It's dedicated to the fighters, the healers, and the conservers of the world that are doing their bit for all of us. It's the shout out. Okay, Ramana, who have you got for us this week, pal?
So the team that brings out something called the World Nuclear Industry Status Report that I mentioned during my interview, this is Michael Schneider and Anthony Frogat and Julie Hasman and a whole bunch of other wonderful people. They bring out annual reports, and you can find them all on World Nuclear Report, all one word, worldnuclearreport.org.
Awesome. And a big thank you to them, and a big thank you to everyone that is listening. And remember, if you're helping the planet in any way at all, no matter how big or small, we love you, we appreciate you, and I hope you'll join us again next time. Take care, everyone.
Thank you so much for listening to the show. If you liked it or enjoyed it, please leave a review or a comment on iTunes and Spotify and tell your friends. Or if you really like the show, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/GND Media UK. And here's a special shout out to all our top tier patrons, including Quilty O'Connor, Guillermo, Harriet Williams, Jill Burke, Karen Taylor, Kaylee Woods Harley, Lizzie, Marie Louise O'Hanrahan, Steve Smith, and Joe Lindstone.